Welcome this evening. I am so glad to see all of you. I see a lot of familiar faces from the previous symposia we had, former students. Yay, thank you for coming back. My name's Heather Thompson. I am a professor here at Michigan. I am in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, History, and the Residential College. And I am one of the team that brought you here today in the capacity of the Carceral State Project. Along with me welcoming you, my colleagues Ashley Lucas, who is in the Residential College and the School of Dance, and she is the director of PCAP, which many of you know very well and love. We also have Ruby Tapia, who could not be with us, but she is an instrumental part of our team. Matt Lassiter in the Department of History, who is running these amazing policing and social justice labs. Amanda Alexander is another part of our team from the Detroit Justice Center. And of course, we also have Nora Konitsky, who is our literal lifeline to be able to pull all this together every time we come together. And we welcome you tonight to this installment of our Symposia series, Confinement and the Carceral State. It is the third of these that we pulled together in this year-long project sponsored by the U of M Carceral State Project, which is a new initiative at U of M seeking to bring together faculty, students, community members, and most importantly, all of us with people most directly impacted by the policies and practices of criminalization, confinement, and control, also now known as the carceral state, bringing us together to examine, research, and overtly challenge the assumptions behind and practices of the same carceral state, or the criminal justice system, that today is extraordinarily deep and wide reach. I'll talk a little bit more on this in a moment, but first I just want to thank the many departments that helped make this convening possible. Very personally, I'd like to thank the Department of African American Studies, the Residential College, and History, because all three have completely stepped up to make this a possibility, but also the Dean's Office and also the Humanities Collaboratory, which allowed us to come together and really plan for this. Our collective vision was to expand understandings of the reach of the carceral state and of carcerality itself. Prisons, of course, but also more than incarceration. We wanted actually to ask the question, what is the carceral state? How vast is it? How deep is its reach? And to do that, we decided to host a series of conversations this year that would help us to illuminate the institutional, political, cultural, and social spaces where punitive logics shape relations and outcomes, where the promise or threat of criminalization and the possibility or ostensible solution of incarceration organizes our society, its procedures, power relationships, and really impacts communities most directly. This we feel is important to do for many reasons, but not the least of which is because we think the carceral state has had far too little inquiry. There's been a lot of number crunching, but not a lot of listening to the people most directly impacted by it, and not a lot of real consideration about how it's done so that we can imagine how to do it differently, what its true costs are so that we can imagine a different, more just justice system. So, at our first kickoff, which was last October, we asked the broad question, what is the carceral state? At our second symposia, we asked the question, what is criminalization and how does it impact communities? And then we actually had a convening of graduate students, which was really amazing. We brought together graduate students from multiple disciplines as well as community folks to talk about how to do responsible and really reflective scholarly activism in this particular area of inquiry. And after tonight, we're going to have 3 more events this semester. One is called Control in the Carceral State. So think surveillance. Think about the other insidious ways this reaches into our lives. Then one called Community in the Carceral State, because of course it is community that is at the very epicenter of why this matters. And then finally our capstone, or the absolute triumph of our end of the year inquiry is going to be called Beyond the Carceral State, where we're going to think really carefully about what we might do differently. Meanwhile, I just want to announce, because I think we're very, very excited about it, we are also in the process of trying to launch a truly historic archival and research endeavor called Documenting Criminalization and Confinement. This initiative initiative will be the first comprehensive effort ever undertaken in the United States in one place to really collect and archive the voices, the writing, the art, the letters, the lived experiences of those in this country who have experienced criminalization, confinement, and control most directly. By working across arts and performance and historical inquiry and preservation and critical inquiry and analysis and community engagement, we hope to create a fundamental and comprehensive archive of this moment when we have embraced tough on crime policies and practices like never before. One model that you might think about is that after enslavement in this country, there was the effort in the New Deal to collect the narratives of formerly enslaved people, and it had some serious problems with it, but the impulse behind it was important, which was how can we possibly understand this catastrophic moment without actually asking the people who most directly experienced it. So we are initiating that as well. We welcome you all here tonight to begin that conversation. And this conversation tonight does, in fact, turn us back to prison. It turns us back to prison and to detention because, of course, this country incarcerates more people, more human beings than any other on the planet, and more than at any other moment in our history. So we have a lot to understand. We have a lot to really demystify, debunk, demyth about what that experience means. And to do that, we've brought people who are absolutely connected to this question and can share their experiences. What we're going to do is we're going to have a series of questions that are going to actually begin first with everyone introducing themselves. Rather than me tell you who they are, I want them to tell you who they are, what brings them here. Then we're going to have a series of questions where they'll have their responses, and then we will open it up to all of you. Sound good? We also have someone who is signing so that we can make this, again, as inclusive as possible. And we're going to have the format beginning with the introduction. So let me get started with that. So, in short, we would love it if you could introduce yourself and highlight what brings you to this panel to speak on this experience of confinement and incarceration and what its broader fallout is for families and society. And why don't we just go right from left and we'll go to right.
Thank you so much, Heather. Can everyone hear me?
You pull that mic maybe a little closer.
Can you hear me now? Okay, that sounds better. So my name is Tanya Morris-Diaz. I am a staff attorney at Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, and I'm a staff attorney as part of the Detroit Front Door program. A little background on Detroit Front Door. This is a brand new program that Merck has tackled. We just started it last year, and really Detroit Front Door came about as a reaction to a needs assessment that Merck had made as to what sort of legal services were most needed in Detroit amongst the immigrant community, especially with the new administration. And so what we found out is that the most pressing need was also the most underfunded and underserved, and that was people in detention. So Detroit Front Door focuses mostly on direct legal representation for those in detention, helping with their deportation defense, and also making sure that every detainee that's been detained by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has access to one free telephone call to Merck so that they can speak with an attorney and get initial consultation as to their case. So I've been a part of this program since its inception. My sort of connection to detention and imprisonment has been through my clients, but also through our Know Your Rights campaign that we have done in terms of detainees knowing their rights, going to these detention centers to make sure that they have the ability to call us, that they have the ability to make any sort of complaints if they're not getting any sort of medical care that's needed, and really just focusing in on the immigrant need of those being detained at such an alarming rate. Thank you.
Welcome.
Hello, my name is Pete Letkeman. I won't pull this any closer because you're probably going to get enough of me this way. So I came in contact with this universe that we sit in now, probably like most people who do end up being involved. And that is my son, right out of high school, got himself into a big bind, a huge bind, and is now into his 12th year of a 20-year minimum with the Department of Corrections. He's up at Kinross in the UP. I stumbled around shortly after his incarceration. He did fairly well, so I didn't have a whole lot of trouble. I didn't seek out anyone. I came across a wonderful group out of Lansing called Citizens for Prison Reform, which I ran into. I met Lois, now Polano, Lois DeMott. Some of you might have heard of her. And she pulled me in, and I ended up doing a stint as vice president there. We deal directly with families primarily, and doing what we can to increase contact between those inside and their loved ones on the outside, helping families negotiate and navigate the system. As a part of that, we ended up, Lois did, I can't take any credit, although I chair the Family Advisory Board to the Michigan Department of Corrections now, which is an informal panel. We have no leverage with the department, but we bring the questions and comments and suggestions directly from families and loved ones on the outside to the Department of Corrections, and hopefully grease the skids of communication where policies from mail and visitation to more serious matters of medical care inside, from the family and loved one's perspective on the outside looking in. And beyond that, we work directly with the Department of Corrections to get a family information packet on their website as a boilerplate part of the budget. It has to be there every time, and we troubleshoot that, edit that, not directly, but by suggestion to the Department of Corrections. And beyond that, I've also been involved with the International Prisoners Conference in Dallas every year, a great organization there. And I also participated in a documentary called Faces of Mass Incarceration. So I spend most of my time at my regular job. This I do on the side, but I deal directly with families, get in contact with me. Probably one of the biggest needs right now that I see is people that are just coming into the system and don't have a clue. They don't know what they don't know until there's trouble. So we're working further and further up that food chain to try to get them information as fast as possible to, in my opinion, a lot of the pitfalls further on in incarceration can be avoided if people know, the people inside, prisoners and their loved ones, know what to expect and how to navigate the system before there's trouble. So, and I thank you so much for asking me here tonight.
Welcome, welcome.
Can everyone hear me? Am I loud and clear? Oh, there we go. That's so my name is Cosine Andre Welch Jr. I think what gives me any level of expertise would be my 20 years served in incarceration in the Department of Corrections. At the age of 17, I committed a series of felonies, which landed me with a sentence of 22 to 40 years. While incarcerated, about 9 years in, I started taking my writing seriously. I connected with the Prisoner Creative Arts Project and began what ended up being an 11-year straight publishing run in the Lit Review. Upon release, I connected with PCAP, obviously, through the linkage community. And today I sit as a co-instructor with the wonderful Ashley Lucas in 2 classes here at the university, the Atonement Project and Theater and Incarceration. I also am fortunate enough to serve as the managing editor of that very literary magazine that I was featured in 11 times, which is a real honor. What brings me here is obviously those things, clearly. But I think more so what brings me here is the fact that you all are here and that there's a real interest in doing something about the carceral state. Now, I'll shorten it that way because I have a lot to say.
Welcome, welcome.
My name's Asia Johnson. I currently work with the Bail Project in the Detroit Justice Center as a bail disruptor. But prior to that, I spent 9 years as a prisoner at Michigan's only prison for women, Women's Huron Valley. During that 9 years, the first couple years were a struggle, but it kindled a fire in me to make change, do something about the women there and anybody who's a returning citizen. That's where my passion truly lies, in making the transition from prison to home smooth and giving us a chance to actually attain success and not be further marginalized by our past. So I'm here tonight because, again, like Cosine said, all of you are here, and hopefully we can kindle that same fire inside some of you so that we can all together make change and end the cycle of mass incarceration.
Welcome, welcome.
My name is Gif Chachevich. I am a clinical social worker. What brings me here is that I was a therapist in Women's Huron Valley with Asia for 2 years. But what brought me there was actually Ashley Lucas, who changed my life because when I was in school to get my social work degree, she came in and spoke at one of our classes, and I went to one of the PCAP's training. And she got me involved with this project out at the Egler facility in Jackson and at Duane Waters, doing end-of-life narrative stories with end-of-life prisoners. And that project inspired Heidi Washington, who was the warden at that time at Egler, to actually formally start the hospice program using prisoner palliative care aides when she became the director. And so when I got my job at Women's Huron Valley, she sent an email to my supervisor and said, Gift Chachevich is starting, and she's going to start the hospice. So I was really lucky to be involved with the committee to start the hospice. I was so fortunate to be in charge of training, developing, and working with the prisoner palliative care aides and how to companion their peers at end of life, and then also just working with the prisoners who were facing end of life behind bars.
Welcome, welcome. And I want to just add in our introduction cycle, because I think it's really relevant, we had also invited someone else to be on our panel who had served a great deal of time in Michigan. And just so that you know that the carceral state continues and continues, it was impossible for him to come here because of the rules of parole. So I wanted to shout that out. We did have other people who we also wanted to include in the conversation, and it was not possible to have them. And I also want to say, yes, you'll notice a theme here, PCAP and Ashley Lucas, which is one of Michigan's truly most incredible programs. So let's go actually straight into it, some of the first question. So the public in general, I think, has a very strong notion, and I see this sometimes when I teach, that those who've ended up confined, detained, or incarcerated have, first of all, have had a fair shake, for starters, in the justice system, from their arrest through their trial. In other words, that if they are locked up, they must have been arrested fairly, and therefore they must be there for a good reason. What is your sense of that? How accurately does that match up with the reality of the experience of actually landing in either detention or confinement?
So, one thing I'd like to say about immigration detention is that it is distinct from the criminal justice system in the sense that detention and immigration is actually a civil matter. So anyone who is going through any sort of deportation proceeding is actually not before, they're not in a criminal trial, this is not the criminal justice system, but it looks and acts and smells just like it. So in a way, immigration detention seems to have the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds, depending on your point of view, in the sense that it has some of the worst features of the criminal justice system, but it does not have sort of some of the ways, the avenues and the rights that people have in order to navigate them. So a lot of people think that those who are in detention, immigrants who are in detention, are somehow illegal or that they belong there. When in reality, by statute, really ICE can only detain someone who has a final removal order, a deportation order, for 90 days. So, and that's a small percentage of the people who are actually incarcerated, of the immigrants who are incarcerated. The rest of them are really what we would call in the criminal justice system, it's pretrial. So they're just actually waiting for their case to be resolved. So for a lot of people who say, well, they came in illegally, still, coming in unlawfully is, once again, a civil matter, and it is a misdemeanor. So imagine everyone who's got a traffic ticket being detained pre-trial without the ability to get out on bond. So there is an ability to get out on bond in immigration, but that is very difficult. There is mandatory detention, and by statute, ICE can detain and should detain those who are a risk to society. So if they have some sort of criminal history that might indicate that they're a danger to society, then they remain incarcerated. However, ICE gets to basically decide whether someone is a danger to society, and recently the NIJC, which is the National Immigrant Justice Center, sent out a FOIA request to ICE to get sort of these numbers of the many immigrants that are being detained. And even though they are in detention, ICE has classified a large majority, more than half of them, as not actually being a danger to society. And because they don't have access to legal counsel, because even though they have a right to an attorney, they don't have the right to, for the government to provide for them an attorney. So a lot of immigrants sort of are faced with a decision. I have money, some of it. Do I use it to pay out my bond? Do I use it for an attorney? Do I use it to consider my future being repatriated when I'm removed? And so they have these decisions to make, and really not a lot of rights or a lot of people helping guide them along this framework that to them seems unfair because, for example, someone may be stopped for driving without a license and they're in the criminal justice system, and as soon as they pay bond or bail to get out of the criminal justice system, they don't actually see the light of day and they're just transferred over to ICE. So a quick story that I can give to sort of highlight how I feel that the way the immigration detention really is an injustice to detainees is I had a client, we'll call her Mary, who was from the Middle East. She came to the U.S. with the plan of seeking asylum in Canada. She had spoken with an attorney in the Middle East. She had family in Canada, and so her plan was to go to Canada to seek asylum. However, there's a bilateral treaty between the U.S. and Canada that wherever you land first, you have to seek asylum, unless you have family. And so she fell into the exception, so the lawyer told her, come to the U.S., cross the border, and you'll be fine. ICE detained her on her way out. So she was trying to leave, she was trying to claim asylum, and she was detained. And worse, they wouldn't let her out when she found out she was pregnant in detention. So we basically had to say, just let her out and we'll continue with the proceedings elsewhere. We'll continue with the proceedings in Buffalo, or we'll continue with the proceedings somewhere else. But let her out so at least she can continue with her pregnancy outside of detention. And ICE decided, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to give her voluntary departure. We want to deport her back to the Middle East. So even though both the detainee wanted to leave the United States and the government wanted her to leave the United States, there was still really no way in which she was able to do what she rightfully and lawfully had the ability to do. So I think that story really highlights that with the new administration's priorities of detaining everyone, they really lose sight as to who, it's really just criminalizing every immigrant just for being an immigrant.
Okay. So your experience as a family member navigating the system, what people think or know?
Yes, it's funny because I listen to so many different stories, and there's so many so-called typical versions out there that you think you know about how someone ends up in prison. I like to be the myth buster on a lot of those things, and I actually had no choice in putting myself out there as such, because my son's case, when it first came out, was front page news far and wide, even made national news for a little while. And so therefore, for the few days before I knew of my son's involvement and it came to light, I was reading the news stories just like everybody else out there. And next thing I know, my son's arrested. There's a news van out in front. Everybody that I've ever heard of and I've ever known from school, I'm not a young man anymore, so way back in the olden days, everybody from school, anyone who I've ever come in contact in this area knew exactly what was going on with us. The prosecutor, Kim Worthy, downtown, held a press conference detailing what she thought had happened with my son and his co-defendant, and held a big old pat on the back for all the law enforcement involved, and basically demonized my son and the other defendant in front of everybody. And then promptly, when I retained an attorney who thought enough of me to allow me to speak, which is almost unheard of, when I started speaking and giving another side to this, not of the case, but of who my son was and who we were, guess what happened next? Gag order. So they got to say exactly what they wanted, But when I wanted to talk about the character of my son and our family, we were accused of trying to taint the jury, and so a gag order was handed down. That was consequently lifted shortly before the trial, which my son ended up not being on trial. I'll get to that in a second. And I was able to get out there a little bit. And personally, I think that that had a lot to do with being able to plead down and end up where we were. He was up for first-degree murder, life without parole. He didn't physically do anything, literally physically did not do anything. It's a co-conspirator type of situation. But what they do, and what I feel they do in a lot of cases, is they overcharge, scare the crap out of everybody, get you to plead down, and move on. Essentially, that's what happened. If my son had been charged with perhaps what he was involved with, we would have gone to trial with it. That being said, what brought me to even further down the line is because everybody knew what had happened to me, and my involvement in the case took a while to conclude before my son finally pled. He gave a full statement to the police without an attorney because he thought he was helping them. He thought he was going to help and go home. Instead, he got a first-degree murder charge. As we went down the road there, it took a few months before I think my being able to speak and get perhaps another side out there a little bit. I'd like to throw in another thing, especially with social media now. It wasn't nearly as prevalent at that time, but the most frightening part of a newspaper story to me is the comment sections underneath. Those people scare me more than anybody I've ever met, incarcerated or otherwise. That is a scary place. So when you're up against that and you're not allowed to speak in public, it really ties your hand behind your back. And the public's perception of my son was what was said on that first day. When the congratulations to the police work, I come to find out their case was made because of my son's statement, thinking he was helping. So that was, I don't hold ill against the police. A lot of the detectives involved were surprised at how my son was ultimately treated. I really think that they tried to give us a fair shake. Ultimately, he pled down and got the 20 to 30-year sentence. He's doing well now. My being out there in public, though, brought other people out of the shadows, friends, neighbors, who I never would have guessed. Hey, I've got a son, I've got an uncle, I've got a cousin incarcerated. People I've known from high school. Hey, my brother's doing life without parole. People don't put themselves out there. And I think that's the single greatest thing that anybody can do immediately is not get in anyone's face. I've always said I don't want to be the guy at the barbecue to go, oh, crap, here comes Pete. We're going to hear about prisons for 3 hours now. But I'm there, and they know my situation. And maybe when they see something on television or in a newspaper article, they may stop and think, well, wait a minute. You know, Pete's son's involved with this. Put a face to it. Put a human being there instead of somebody you can make a callous comment on and move on. So that's how I ended up where I am.
Thank you, Pete. Cosine.
Does everyone get a fair shake? Quick answer, no. I'll give you a few personal and broad examples to back that up. First, we'll do a logical deduction. So we all assume that every human being is born the same with the same, assuming you don't have any mental disability that allows you not to compute like the average human being does, we assume that everyone is equal. Yet if we look at our criminal justice system, we see a large, overwhelming majority of one particular type of person or persons being incarcerated. That right there shows you, as far as I'm concerned, that it's not a fair shake at all. I'll give you a personal example. In my case, I was shot from behind when I was on the ground. That's not to minimize what happened, but this is what happened while I was being detained at the hospital. I was 17 years old. I was not allowed to see my mother or my father. I was handcuffed by the very limbs that had a bullet still lodged in 2 parts of it, as well as my other limb, and I was not allowed to eat or drink, under the guise that I was going to surgery soon. A day later, I still had not attained surgery because detectives wanted to question me and get a confession from me. That's not a fair shake. The broader example I can give you is the very fact that quick backstory. While incarcerated, I was what was called a legal writer. So what I did in that capacity was I prepared post-conviction remedies and briefs for prisoners who were unable to read, write, or speak the language, or for any other reason that they could not carry on in post-conviction remedies themselves. And what you do when you study the laws, you see time after time similarly situated circumstances and drastically different outcomes. That shows you right there it's not a fair shake. If it's a fair shake, then anything that is exactly the same produces the exact same effect. The fact that our criminal justice system does not have that in any capacity, to me, says all I need to know about the fact that there is not a fair shake given to anyone. We have to remember that we are in America, the land of milk and honey and opportunity, if you know the right people and have the right pocketbook. Let's not forget what capitalism does to everything. Capitalism is involved in the criminal justice system, so those who have resources tend to have a better outcome. That's not a fair shake. Those who start off at the bottom tend to stay there, not because they are incapable of rising. I will use myself as an example. I am co-teaching at the University of Michigan. I'm a published poet 4, 5, 6 times over. That is not because I was incapable at the beginning, but because throughout the process, I was given resources and opportunity that I had not had before. I did not somehow in the intervening years grow a larger percentage of my brain capacity. I was the same human being, but I was a human being given different resources than I had before. So no, it's not a fair shake. But hopefully this starts a conversation and eventually implements processes that will result in more.
Thank you, Aisha.
Absolutely not. It's not a fair shake. It has a lot to do with resources, parents you were born to, community you live in, friends, family, what type of support you have. As a bail disruptor, I post the bail for people who cannot afford to pay their bail themselves. A majority of the people that are in the county jail are sitting there pre-trial, have not been convicted of a crime, yet cannot pay their bond. And that goes for people with traffic tickets, to people with domestic violence charges, to murder charges. A lot of people that are sitting there have not been to trial, have not been convicted, and they cannot pay their $500 bond or their $5,000 bond. There was a story years ago of a young man named Khalif Browder from New York. He was a young man, a teenager. He stole someone's backpack, I believe it was, and he had a $100 bond. In New York, if you commit a crime in New York City, you go to Rikers Island. Everyone goes to Rikers Island. He was a young man. He was assaulted. He went through the worst trauma in that jail. He comes out. He has the support of so many people, Jay-Z, Rosie O'Donnell. He gets his tuition paid at the local community college, and he still committed suicide after spending that time at Rikers Island because of the bail system, because he could not pay the $100 bail that it took. And so the bail system has gotten a lot of attention because of that one story. So as a bail disruptor, again, we pay the bail of people who can't post it themselves. What I've seen is that we criminalize the poor, we criminalize the mentally ill, we criminalize the marginalized people. Is it a fair shake? Absolutely not. Like you said, like you can have 2 of the same charges, and 2 people will have drastically different sentences. Your judge may have had a bad day. They may have fell down the stairs that morning, stumped their toe, got their purse stolen the night before, and all of that they're going to take out on you as you stand before them. Maybe you couldn't afford the best attorney. Maybe you have a public defender who has a million cases because of the resources in that city. You're not going to get a fair shake. I am the exception to the rule. I committed a crime that could have sent me to prison for the rest of my life. And I got 9 years. In prison, I did what it took, what I had to do to get out of there. I could have been sitting there for 30 years because 30 years was my maximum. I got the mental health treatment that I needed. I took classes. I was a mentor. I was a tutor. But everybody doesn't have the ability to do those things. Everybody, when you go in there, you come into prison, you come in broken. Not just because of your crime, but because of your life. Because of what society has given to you, which is sometimes nothing. So you come in broken, and you have to be strong enough to build yourself back up. And if you don't have the support from home, if you don't have an organization like PCAP or Shakespeare in Prison, you have nothing in there. Therefore, you sit in there and you deteriorate. All because maybe you couldn't pay the bond. Maybe you couldn't afford an attorney. Maybe you committed a crime and that judge did not care about the circumstances surrounding the crime, only about punishing you. So no, it's definitely not a fair shake.
Okay, thank you, Aisha.
The legal system is just one system, and we all exist in various systems that intersect, and we all know that there is disparity in all of those systems, regardless of whatever you're part of, your economic system, your health system, any of those things. And so from the mental health perspective, this really plays out a lot in that if if things were fair, right, you would imagine the people who were in prison would be the same demographics as we have out in the world, in our communities. But it's not. So at Women's, when I was there, half of the population that we had in there were in mental health services. And we had hundreds more who were desperate for mental health services, but who didn't pass intake as having a mental health disorder. And because the women's population in prisons are increasing and we don't meet the need to meet those needs, we did not have enough providers to be able to meet all of those needs for people who did genuinely want mental health treatment and work on their self-defined issues. What struck me when I first started doing my project with the end-of-life prisoners was that every man that I interviewed had a history of trauma. They might not have classified it as that, they might not have talked about it in that way, but it was clearly trauma. Trauma that happened, early in their lives, and again, from this mental health perspective, we know that you learn from your family groups. I'm not going to say your parents, because sometimes the people who raise you aren't your parents, but you learn from your family groups. And with the prison system, what you have is a lot of intergenerational trauma, because people don't have those family groups to teach them how to regulate their emotions, to make good decisions, to, find the resilience within themselves to make other choices in the face of really hard choices. So, like I said, it's pretty apparent. I mean, if you're watching news at all, like all the things that happen today, in the past, like we see it all the time. And so, absolutely not.
Could I just ask a follow-up question? Because working with mental health issues, what is your sense of how much that figures into the trial piece of it, or the prosecution piece of it? Is anyone asking those relevant questions before someone is incarcerated?
So, before I left, I went into the intake side of the mental health process in prison. And in the few months that I was doing that, what struck me was we had several women who came back to prison because they were suicidal. Why are you going to prison because you're suicidal? Why aren't you getting mental health treatment? Why, if you're asking for mental health treatment to help with your suicidality, to help with your addictions, why are you going back to prison?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Real
Sure.
quick, Heather. And also on the outgoing end of that mental health issue, we're finding that, picture this, you're sentenced to a term of years, 10 to 15, say, and you've done everything you're supposed to do, running up against that 10-year mark, and then within the 2 years before your ERD earliest release date, not early release date, earliest release date, you go through a psychological profile, and they determine you need more programming. MDOC doesn't have the staff or the facilities to meet that programming, so you are forced to stay in prison longer than your ERD for no other reason than that programming wasn't available, because they don't have the staff or the mechanisms to do it. And that's a real problem. Mm-hmm. That's happening right now.
With me, I struggled with depression in the years leading up to my crime. And that mental health aspect was definitely taken into consideration when the judge was sentencing me. But when I got to prison, I realized, like she said, half of the women there struggle with some sort of mental health issue. And their judges didn't take their illness, their diagnosis into consideration at all. I spent a year in a hospital before I actually went to prison, where I got help. But those resources aren't available to everybody because the state doesn't have the money. It takes more than double the amount of money to keep somebody in a hospital than it does to house them in the prison. So instead of sending someone who's mentally ill to the Center for Psychiatric Forensic Psychology, or whatever it's called, the Forensic Center, instead of sending them there, it's way cheaper. They save so much more money to send them to prison. So it's about money. It's about capitalism. It's not about our mental health at all.
And I'd also like to say it's about shame. When you look at the your introduction to prison and the evaluation you go to, as well as he spoke on the evaluation at the end, you have two perspectives on that. So I'll speak from a personal note. So in my life, I've attempted suicide 3 times, 2 times while incarcerated, 1 time before. And when my evaluation before going in, that question is posed in such a way as to demean you. So when you admit, like, well, yeah, I did like a Russian roulette thing, they're like, oh, well, how do you feel now? Well, I don't want to. Well, because you're going to prison, there's so much effort often. I can't speak for everyone's case, but because that requires extra work on the side of all those involved, right? And so now it means, like Asia said, we have to now classify you differently and pour more resources into you, or we can find some way to skirt you just along and hope you'll be all right, because that impacts our pocketbook, so to speak, less harshly. And then when it comes to the end of term, if you're fortunate enough to have gone through there and found some way to get yourself through those feelings, and you get to the end and you think, I kind of really need some help because I have these strong things I think need to be dealt with, you're faced with the option of, well, do you want to stay in prison? Because sure, we'll put you on a waiting list for our under-resourced department and get you some subpar, mediocre help that likely won't do anything unless you are already at a place where you're willing to do enough of the work yourself, or you can go home right now. And faced with those options, who chooses the former? And a lot of that, I say, is based around shame. The reason these conversations are coming up now, because as a larger community, we become more aware from our own personal experiences and the experience we find of those we know and love that we didn't realize they were going through, that this is really an epidemic that demands an approach, demands attention. So as that perspective changes in our society as a whole, then it seems, as you would hope anyway, largely deduce that our institutions will similarly produce a change. But in the way of that, as is always, is the idea of money and monetary sources. Because it takes money to do anything. We have equated anyone's time and energy in a sense of how much money it takes, which I understand in our society is a necessary evil to some respect. But because we monetize it as opposed to looking at the end result and how much that end result is worth to us, we see so many fall through the cracks. I remember a young man I met, he sticks out to me a lot because I was in solitary confinement, and his thing was he just wanted to go home. Like he would say, I just want to go home. And he felt like his only way to do that was to attempt suicide because home was out of reach. Thankfully, he didn't succeed, but others I know have. And that is because there is shame around your mental health. There is shame by those in your social group and peer group through straight ignorance, and shame through our institutions for the lack of a desire to put forth the time, money, and resources required.
Thank you.
Just one quick sentence
Yeah.
to add to that. Another thing I run into with families that I deal with, as you're going through intake, you're going into a place where you're getting thrown into an environment where any sign of weakness is an invitation to somebody to press you for something. And when they're asking you those questions on intake, the last thing you want to do is admit some type of weakness that somebody else can take advantage of, and that's working against you too, regardless of resources. People are keeping it to themselves because there's no way I'm letting this group here that I'm about to get tossed into know that this, that, or the other thing is wrong with me.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yes, and thank you also for pointing out, Cosine, the way in which prisons themselves make people, anyone who's already struggling, much, much worse in terms of especially solitary. So thank you for that. That's a great segue to the next question, because just as people are largely uninformed about the fairness of the system that leads to incarceration or detention, I think it's also a real problem that people don't fully understand what the experience of confinement really looks like, or that also gets somehow romanticized as either the myths, the country club, the place where someone would rather be. And I know that there's probably thousands of stories that you could each share, but perhaps you could share with us some perspective on what does it really mean to do time, whether it is through a detention center, whether it is incarcerated. What does it mean emotionally, physically? What is that experience that the American people just needs to know and has no clue about?
So I want to speak as an attorney with clients who have been detained, but also as a daughter of an immigrant myself, that I want to say that instead of one story, I really want people to understand how the immigration and the immigrant community is feeling now, because detention for immigration has not been used as punishment. It hasn't been used as a means of securing immigrants who are dangerous. Detention has been used as a means of enforcement. And so there is a before and after of detention. The before of that is for many asylum seekers, before they even get to detention, they have to trek from, mostly people are coming from Central America, crossing through Mexico, where they have been targets of trafficking, of sex trafficking, of labor trafficking. So even before getting into detention, there's sort of the trauma that is lived by these asylum seekers, and then they're put in detention. And then there's sort of the after effect of detention, which is really just banishment, which was what we just called deportation. So whenever someone's deported, it's almost impossible for them to return. They can't return legally for 10 years. And I feel like the biggest ripple effect that this is having in the immigration community can best be sort of described as a very famous song from Los Tigres del Norte, which is a Mexican band that says that aunque la jaula sea de oro, sigue siendo prisión. So even though this bird cage is made of gold, the United States, it's still a prison. So for many people who aren't even in detention, for many people who are here undocumented, they have a fear, a very great fear that paralyzes them, where they can't go out, they fear going to work, they fear picking up their kids from school. So even though they're not in detention, they feel imprisoned here. And going back isn't an option either, because there's certain fear that they face there. So I want to speak more of the detention effects in the immigration community, that it's far-reaching for more than just those who find themselves in detention. The entire immigration community has really just been affected by this new administration. We get a lot of phone calls from parents who don't want to enroll their children in public benefits that they are eligible for, because they fear that by sharing that information, when they enroll or renew public benefits, that they'll get put in detention. And detention isn't the biggest fear for most immigrants. The fear is getting deported. The fear is also not knowing when you'll be deported. The fear is getting deported and what will happen to my kids that remain here. The fear is, when I get deported, will the fear that drove me to come here still exist? Will I get killed when I get there? So in the immigration sense, detention is far more than just being confined and waiting for your asylum trial or waiting to get out on bond. This fear has been far-reaching in the community, that it's paralyzed them in ways that really shouldn't. And so I think I want people to know that in the immigration community, detention has gone beyond the walls of just the 4 prisons that house immigrants here in Michigan. It's their own house. They feel imprisoned in their own house. They feel imprisoned in this country, that they can't leave or that they'll be forced to leave. So I have many stories, like Heather said, but I feel like really what's missing for a lot of people who don't have that connection to an immigrant is knowing that criminalizing and using detention as a means of enforcement has had the effect that I think this administration wants, and that is making immigrants feel unwanted, unworthy, and basically subhuman.
Thank you. Pete.
For me, as a father of a prisoner, probably one of the biggest frustrations in a general sense is, and I hesitate to say everyone, but it is largely agreed upon by almost anyone you're going to talk to, whether it's MDOC, social professionals, social work professionals, parents, right down to the staff at the prisons, and that is that contact with good people on the outside is one of the primary drivers to a successful reentry, period. And it's hard to find somebody who's going to argue against that. What's frustrating is they say that, yet the actions don't match those words. They give absolutely no consideration to where they're placing a prisoner compared to what could be amazing support systems on the outside. I don't know how many in here realize how many prisons there are in Michigan. The number is going down, but it's well over 20, closer to 30. They finally closed down Michigan Siberia up in the western UP, which is about 10 hours from Detroit. So, hey, family, they're coming home to you. We need your help all the way along, but you know what? We're going to make it as hard as possible for you to see them or talk to them along the way. A little illustration of that is the fact that Department of Corrections uses visits as a weapon to punish inmates, even in circumstances where whatever violation they might have had inside had nothing to do with a visit. 2 substance abuse tickets, which includes tobacco. Tobacco is a substance that, if you get a ticket for tobacco in prison, it's a substance abuse ticket. 2 of those, regardless of how long apart they were, 5, 10 years, could get you visit restrictions for life. Nothing to do with the visit at all. Nothing to do with trying to smuggle anything in or any funny business in the visit room. They do not want to. There's nothing legislatively that prevents them from doing that, and they don't want to give up that weapon, as it can be pretty effective. However, it flies in the face, in my opinion, of what they say they want to do. Contact with good people is on the outside is a primary driver, but we're going to take that away from you usually for at least a year, and then you have to petition to get it back. Specific cases of things that happen inside, as everybody says, there's hundreds of them, and there's some silly. I mean, my son got a ticket once for not getting his shirt back on fast enough after a basketball game, and so he was going to receive an LOP, loss of privileges, for 3 or 5 days. The corrections officer held out his hands, told him to pick a hand. In one there was a number 3, in one there was a number 5, and that determined how many days of loss of privileges he was to get. On a more serious note, people don't. I don't think people have an understanding of time or any minute during any day. Sometimes I'll lay down at night, turn off my light, and think about my son. He's in a cube with it's an open dorm style with who knows how many other men he's going to bed to. I often think about what he's thinking. But I go up to visit, and my son was involved. He wasn't directly involved. He was there during in Kinross during what he calls the Great Cheese Sandwich Riot of 2016, and that was when you might have heard a general strike across the country. It morphed into a slight disobedience by some inmates at that facility, where they walked around in the yard in unison, which you cannot do anything in unison in prison, or it's inciting a riot. It calmed down. They all went inside. About an hour later, everybody was in their bunk. Next thing you know, staff, and this is a frightening thing as a parent of somebody inside, the staff abandoned the unit because they were bringing in the squad, the mobile squad. Yep.
The goon squad.
Yeah, I wouldn't call them the goon squad.
Yeah.
But anyway, as soon as they bailed on the unit, some of the more excitable inside decided, all right, game on, and that's when the crap hit the fan. At that moment, anything could have happened to any inmate in there, any retribution, all the horror stories, Heather, you've written about extensively, that's when it could have happened. And it was because they did not have the staff there to take care of what should have been a smooth transition to get the troublemakers that they wanted to get out of there, or they could have waited a day or two. I rolled up to the prison, incidentally, the next day for a visit, and it was met by a county sheriff at the gate. Nope, sorry, we're under mobilization. So, at that minute, anything could have been going on inside there. Anything. Nobody, because they don't let word out, because they don't want word to get to other facilities to possibly incite action somewhere else. Nobody knew anything that was going on in that facility except for the Department of Corrections and other government officials for more than a day. Afterward, I find out, after I talked to my son, what they did is my son's sense of humor, I'm sorry, but after the staff had abandoned and they killed the cameras and trashed the bubble, or part of the bubble, the units came in with the riot squad with the pepper spray guns. They're like paintball guns filled with pepper spray. And at that point, they said the guys were all laying in their bunk and saying, "We're sorry, we won't do it again." Silly stuff like that, but it was anything but silly. They took them one by one, zip-tied their hands behind their back, brought them out, pouring rain that night, it rained all night, out on the tarmac, in the yard, one by one. They sat there for about 4 hours in the rain, zip-tied. Some of the bigger guys, They were forced to sit with their arms zip-tied behind their back and cross-legged. These big fellas couldn't quite do that. And so the one guy got up, sat on the picnic table. They told him to sit down, back on the ground. He said, I couldn't. Barrage of pepper spray balls. It was like they got to use their equipment, and by golly, they're going to use it. I'm not saying they weren't within their legal rights to do it, but at some point, it's not what's right. It's what do you really have to do. So as a person on the outside, I don't think people can quite understand the sheer terror of having somebody on the inside. It's almost worse because every possible scenario is running through your mind of what's going on in there compared to the guys on the outside, on the inside who know what they have to do by and large, and 99.9% of them, and women, forgive me, are doing what they're supposed to do, getting in their bunk and keeping their mouth shut. But everything inside falls down to the lowest common denominator. Guys going from one facility to the other, they had fans with them. They didn't have them in the new facility. The guys complained, so did they give everybody fans? No. They take them away. Everything is the lowest common denominator. My son's being transferred from one unit to the next, took his pillow with him because he didn't know what was going to be waiting him in the next cell. Got there was already a pillow. 2 minutes later, he got a ticket for having too many pillows. LOP, 10 days, loss of privileges, no telephone, no anything. So it's a society within a society, and I can't speak to the actual experience myself personally, but as somebody on the outside trying to do their best for their loved one inside, and your loved one inside trying to do their best to do what they need to do to get out, to all of a sudden get written a ticket, like it throws a lot. Some people it becomes a snowball. They get that first ticket, and then they mouth off a second ticket. Guard, yeah, grabs your arm, you pull away. Oh, assault. I mean, you cannot believe how quick that stack gets up. I know guys that the next thing you know, they're doing 60 days in the hole. My son did Christmas and New Year's in the hole 1 year because he was forced to defend himself. Well, they're not going to take time to decide who started it. You're fighting, boom, in the hole, seg. And I guess people seem to think that it's all TV prison where it's either everybody's pounding on each other constantly or it's a country club. And they don't realize that there are guys inside, women inside who have no intention of doing their time well. And then there's a vast majority who's trying to get their time done and get the heck out of there. There is this vast in-between that people out here don't understand. And I don't think I'm exaggerating that point.
Yeah, and it also bears mention that, of course, for a panel like this, we could not have children up here telling their stories. But, of course, everything you describe is duplicated and exacerbated in juvenile facilities where they have absolutely no power and no one to speak for them. So thank you for sharing that.
That's a wonderful question, but I think the question kind of lends to our general perspective, which I think is often off. And that is, we believe there is an answer, right? We have this idea, whether we're conditioned from our American experience or human experience in general, we assume that if there's a problem, there is one solution. When the fact of the matter is that any problem that everyone knows about this story about the straw that broke the camel's back, right? Everyone knows that single straw broke the camel's back, but no one speaks about the 1 million other straws that were put on the camel before the back broke. The single straw was simply the last one that was one too many, but the million before will be seem to brush to the side. And so we often want to know, well, what is the one thing? There is not one thing. There are many things, but if I am to give you a general one thing, it's fear. Fear on both sides. Fear is used as a weapon, and fear is something that people internalize and then act out of. And typically can't think of any time I was afraid and I did the right thing. So when you're in an environment where fear and anxiety is the constant, you are afraid of the correctional officer. You are afraid of the institution as a whole and its ever-changing, ambiguous rules that may be in black and white but may not have to be followed by an officer who now, depending upon this circumstance, has the authority to go outside of it. You're afraid of those who are in there with you, who have suffered themselves. Hurt people do hurt people. So it makes all the sense in the world to me that you would be in an area where a bunch of people have been hurt systematically and now seek out to hurt others for either their own benefit or sometimes because they're just caught in the conditioning of that cycle. So fear is what I always see. And I will show you, you may not expect to hear this from me, but I will give you another perspective. Think about the correctional officer, 2 of them, who are in a unit of 500 prisoners. Think about the fear they must feel and how they may feel that they have to assert their authority by seeing that extra pencil on your shelf and giving you 5 days loss of privileges. They have to show that they are tough, that they are in control because they're deathly afraid. Think of the prisoner who is deathly afraid of physical assault and thinks that, you know what, I got to show them I'm rough. I got to show them about it. I can think of myself, my very first day in level 4 confinement. I got a knife. It was all I spent all my time doing because I was deathly afraid of I was 18 by the time I made it there, of being around all these grown men who were just like the men I grew up with. So I knew what they were capable of, both on the good end and the bad end. And we're never afraid of what good might happen. We're afraid of what bad might come to us. So that fear is the constant that is always going on both sides that we never seem to address. And we use it punitively. So are you afraid of spending more time in prison? Yes, I am. Well, in that case, do this thing or suffer that consequence. Even if doing this thing has become criminalized, but it may be something you're used to conditionally. But no one takes that into consideration. So it's such a question that is so difficult to answer, but I would say it's the fact that we are not aware and do not address how deep our own fears run and how they inform our biases and our decisions and how they lead us to marginalize people that we shouldn't. It's fear and oftentimes unreasonable, but we don't address it.
Thank you.
So I'm from Detroit, from the right side of the tracks, but in Detroit, really, every side is the wrong side of the tracks. And I think that in inner cities, there's a grooming that happens. There's a pipeline to prison, whether the grooming is directly happening to you or one of your classmates or your neighbor. You see people getting in trouble constantly, and you see what happens to them. And then you come to expect that for yourself. My first night in prison, I told you I spent a year in the hospital prior to. They didn't prepare me for what was to come. I was scared. I was 23 years old. I had seen what prison was like on TV. You needed a shank. You were going to get raped in the shower. I was scared. So they asked me if I was okay, the intake officer, and I said no, and I was crying. Next thing you know, I am stripped. I've had my clothes taken from me. I am in a cell by myself, cold, because now I am on suicide precautions. All because I said, no, I am not okay. Years down the line, when I gotten myself in order, I myself was the person who had to sit on the suicidal person. So in prison, there are prisoner observation aides. When I got to prison, officers sat on suicidal inmates. And then they realized they were wasting money, wasting money. They're paying officers $20-something an hour to sit down in front of a cell. Why, when you can pay a prisoner $3 a day to do the same job? So I became the person that had to sit on these prisoners who shouldn't have been locked in a room behind a door naked, all because they're experiencing depression or some sort of trauma that they've had in childhood that brought them to prison. There would be days where I'd be in a poetry class or a PCAP class or performing Shakespeare. And during those moments, you don't forget you're in prison, but it's like you're not there for that time. And then you get back to your cell. Maybe your unit is locked down because somebody has broken a rule. So now you have to go to your bunk, you have to sit there because one other person broke one single rule and now the whole unit is being punished for it. There are times when it hits you that you're in prison, when you're walking to the chow hall a quarter mile away in the wintertime, snow coming from the sky, ice on the ground. They don't give you a coat with a hood. Like those are those moments that hit you and it's like, wow, I'm not at home anymore. I am not a human being anymore. So there are times now, I've been home for 3 months. There are times now when it hits me that I'm home, that I don't have to be on my bunk at 4 o'clock and 11 o'clock. I don't have to worry about somebody coming into my room and shaking it down for no reason. I don't have to worry that if I'm sad, somebody's going to come and punish me and put me in a cell behind a wall and strip me. The being in prison is not what it looks like on TV. It's not a country club. It's not somewhere that people want to go. It's not somewhere that people need to be. There are alternatives to prison. A lot of the people in prison struggle with addiction. They don't get the help that they need. The mental health aspect, they don't get the help that they need. Even people who've committed violent crimes, they aren't getting the help that they need. So what can we do to help people not go to prison in the first place, and once they return, not go back to prison? Nobody wants to be there. There are people who go back and forth and back and forth. There are people who get out and they go back 3 months later, not because they want to go back to prison, but because they don't have any other options. It's about resources. It's about having support. And that's why this event is so important. Sunday, I sat on a panel for PCAP training. The volunteers are the ones who make the most. It's not the corrections officers. Sadly, it's not the therapist. It's not the warden. Those aren't the people that have the most impact on us. It's the people that come in there and give their time freely. It's the PCAP volunteers, the Shakespeare volunteers, the people from Eastern who come and teach us poetry. Like, we need people in there that truly, truly care about us and invest in us. That's what's going to help us come home. That's what's going to help us not catch tickets. That's what's going to help us realize, oh, we have loved ones. We have a dad out there that cares about us. But if you're on LOP because an officer wrote you a frivolous ticket, you can't call your dad. You can't call anybody. And most people don't have a dad to call.
Thank you.
So I will speak from staff perspective. So my coworkers used to joke around with me and say that I didn't actually believe in prison because what prison is supposed to be about is like rehabilitation or something like that. And what we often fail to understand is that the punishment for your crime is being incarcerated. There shouldn't be additional punishments for you while you're there beyond like rules or whatever, which are very often frivolous, but like what you are ingrained with when you come to work in prison is a prisoner's a prisoner. That's it. So they're not even humanized. A prisoner is a prisoner. That's it. No other, regardless of whatever trainings you go through, prisoner is a prisoner. Prisoner is a prisoner. I would go to trainings where I would go to mental health trainings in prison for staff taught by corrections officers, where the corrections officer would say, so you guys chip in when there's like, when I've got something wrong. And it would literally be like, just being like, okay, all of this is wrong. So that's one perspective of staff, right? The other thing is you're not allowed to touch people. So when I was working with people at end of life, that's really tough. It's really tough not to hold your hand. For us to get prisoner contact between the prisoner palliative care aides for the prisoners who were dying, we had to write up and put diagrams and put literally markers on your arm and diagram of how far you could touch somebody on the arm while you're sitting with them while they're dying, like literally dying, actively dying. So there's like no contact. There's this, I mean, like, I don't know what you guys did when you guys were in cell, but in general, you're not allowed to touch people. And then also too, like from another staff perspective, one of the therapists used to say, for staff too, it could also feel like they're in prison, not in the same way, and that's not in any way to equivocate.
No, not at all. Not at all.
In many ways. But you have to follow a whole different set of rules. For staff, as we were mentioning, we're understaffed. So, especially for corrections officers, in these situations, they are mandated to stay 16-hour shifts, maybe 5 days that week. So, there is a lot of stress from the staff perspective. And it is rare to find staff who understand that why people are there is the punishment, and that nothing else needs to be done to punish, to seek justice. And at least for me, when I would interact with, my prisoner palliative care aides or the prisoners who were dying or even the prisoners on my caseload, I always did my best to make sure they understood that I viewed them as a human being with their own experiences, and they came here with their own uniqueness that I only had the privilege to try and understand and try and help them work through. And it isn't like in TV. I think it's in many ways much sadder, because prisons don't have to be like they are in the States. They don't. Like, Scandinavian prisons are in no way, shape, or form like they are in the States. And, maybe part of that is because of their social systems. They place an emphasis on health, on families, on mental health. But this is not the only way to seek justice.
Well, that is a perfect segue. We have 15 minutes before I want to give our audience a chance to speak, because I know that there's a lot of folks with questions and experience to share as well. So for our last comments to take us to discussion, what are your thoughts? Anything else that you'd like people to know that they might not, or thoughts on exactly this question? How do we do it differently? Or what might be another way to think about the justice system that prison has no place in? Or detention, in this case.
I think something that I'd like to say is that I hear a lot of people say that we need to fix the immigration system, there needs to be immigration reform. The immigration system is not broken. It functions exactly as it was intended to, and that is to perpetuate white dominance. Essentially, immigration law is racist. And as a function of that, the whole detention as an enforcement is also an extension of that racism, and it's an extension of perpetuating white dominance. So a lot of the people that I see incarcerated, or detained, because they're not technically incarcerated, a lot of the immigrants I see detained were brought to the attention of local police, and they were brought to the attention of local police from racial profiling, basically. So because immigration law as on a broad level is racist, the detention portion of immigration is probably the most racist of immigration law itself. And so this Trump administration, this rhetoric, this narrative of criminalizing immigrants, it's not criminalizing immigrants, it's criminalizing a certain type of immigrant. Mm-hmm. Because just recently, Trump tweeted, so I have Trump tweet alerts because I feel like if there's a war, that's how I'll find out first. He tweeted how he wanted to give H-1B, that's work visa for particularly special categories. He wants to give them a path to citizenship, while simultaneously making sure that no asylum seekers can come in. So what does that say? We don't want brown people coming in, escaping poverty, but we do want rich, educated, white Europeans coming in and becoming citizens. What does that say? So I think what I want to leave this audience with is that detention system and immigration is just, it's really a monster. It's a monster in the sense that there are laws behind it that don't allow these people to have certain rights. There are limits to resources and restrictions on access to those resources that mean that they can't have any sort of legal representation, or they don't have the money to pay for bond, or even if they do, they'll get deported anyways. This has created an entire community of people living in fear, an entire community of people feeling unwanted. And detention is just one aspect of that. It's just one aspect of this larger monster of a system that is attacking those who don't look like citizens, those who are in power, those white men who are in power decide they don't have the right to become citizens. They don't have the right to even live here, and they don't have the right to live here without fear. So what Merck is doing, it's just a small drop in the water of what we can do. The Detroit Front Door program was started as a way to make sure that we could have some way of getting in touch with those in detention, that we could help them get out on bond, that we could make sure that they weren't being educated in the language that they spoke, so we're making sure to have Know Your Rights presentations, Know Your Rights material in Spanish and Arabic and in French. So the most that we can do as attorneys beyond direct representation is just empowering those individuals with knowledge. And unfortunately, knowledge isn't enough, because a lot of times I'll be on a phone call with a detainee telling him or her, you really have no options. So today is the day that you need to decide whether you accept a deportation order or you pay for your own ticket back. So it doesn't seem like help a lot of days, but really there are some attorneys out there who prey on these individuals and say, no, you can definitely get out, just pay me $5,000, I'll make sure it happens, when by law it's impossible. So even though Merck's role is to educate the community, to represent them, we feel a lot of times, I feel personally a lot of times, that we're going against the current. So the most I can do at events like these is just sort of spread this information to those who don't have a connection, or who maybe are unaware of what's going on, or who are hearing so much of what's going on in terms of immigration that they don't know really what's happening because they're bombarded with information. So for anyone out there who still has lingering questions, or who knows people who need to speak with an immigration attorney, we have a hotline where you can call us and we will give free legal advice to everyone that calls us. We'll try to put them with a pro bono attorney. We'll put them in connection with other organizations, because we only have so many resources of those that we can represent. If we can represent them, we do, and if we can't, we point them in the right direction. But really what Merck is trying to do is just sort of swim against this current of what's going on right now, and we're hoping to have everyone here sort of part of that battle, and to help as many people as they can in terms of educating, and in terms of not spreading this misinformation, and not spreading this rhetoric of hate, and not spreading this racism, and really calling it for what it is. It is racist. And so that's really what I sort of want to leave on a note, and really what I have been trying to do as my role as an attorney. And I thank you for everyone here today joining me as part of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Last comments.
I think probably one thing I want to leave this room with is something that every single person can do. It's something that, because I stumbled my way into the system the way I did, I ended up doing simply by being, and that is, people tend to care and engage more with an issue when they know somebody personally who's going through something, or it's happening to somebody themselves, or to somebody they care deeply about. So I guarantee you that there's people in this room, if you don't think you know somebody who has a family member incarcerated, you do. You just haven't heard it yet. And if you ever see an opening like that, to be that person that others will think about when they're hearing about criminal justice reform, or when some godforsaken news story comes on and you're ready to, wheel out the gallows because you heard a 10-second soundbite and you're sure they're guilty. What I like people to do is think about people like us. And that is, when they see a story, they hear something, they say, well, wait a minute. Pete's family is going through that, and there's no way that's what brought them to that. Or any one of these people that you see out after being incarcerated and doing, quote unquote, the right thing, and not the, you don't hear about the 10,000 that go out and are leading productive lives. You get the one, knucklehead that went out and, reoffended in 10 minutes. Keep your open mind. Be that person. Try to understand, as hard as it is to try to explain your position to people who don't know, it's even harder for people who have to look back 10 years and try to relive that to try to make people understand. It's very difficult. But at some point, even up to the point of parole, where the first thing they do is go back to what brought you here to begin with, even if it was 20 years ago, is at some point during incarceration, it has to be less about who they were and what they did, and more about who they are and what they've become.
Yes.
And we don't recognize that. You see that flash in the pan, whether it's a small crime or some big deal, and then 10 years later you hear they're getting released, and you don't know anything about what happened, what transpired in the middle of that. Well, there's people out here that can tell that story, and now that you've heard these stories, you can be the person that tells other people these stories. And as I said, don't be that person that people dread coming up because you're a one-trick pony. But if they know you know and they've got a question, they will come and they'll ask. And you can be that person. Another thing I'd like to leave you with is the fact that there are a lot of things happening in the criminal justice system. It's baby steps, but the drift is floating the right way. I don't care what somebody's motive is for wanting to reform what's going on. I don't care if it's humanitarian. I don't care if it's because they have a loved one and it's selfish. I don't care if they're trying to save money by closing down more prisons. Work with those people. Don't shut them out. Don't look at their motives. If you're working in the same direction, help them push. When you hear about good time, that's something I want to get that term banned. I want it called earn time. There's people inside that are going to do nothing but cause trouble. There's people inside who are going to do nothing but vegetate until they get out. And then there's people who are going to work hard towards something. How about we start positive reinforcement on these people that are working hard and start letting them knock some time off for the benefit of everybody involved? Those are some basic things. Bail reform, huge. You're going to be hearing about these things legislatively. Don't just say, yeah, I agree, or maybe a heart or a smiley face. Get to know your legislator. Give them a call. Hey, I heard about Bill XYZ. What do you say about that? Because I think it's a great idea. You'd be surprised at how much weight that pulls. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Cosine.
In closing, I want to do a couple of things. I want to encourage you, but I also want to hold you accountable. I want to tell you the stark truth of reality as we know it now and a possible future. I'm afraid to walk through Ann Arbor when I'm not with my friends. That's the truth. I'm worried about a police officer seeing me as I walk through Ann Arbor with my University of Michigan Residential College t-shirt on, blasting PCAP all the way. I'm afraid. I bought a car that had a chip in the windshield, and I spent my last money to get it replaced because I was afraid of getting pulled over on parole. That's the harsh reality of what today is. You have privilege. If you're in this room, if you're watching, if you're listening, you have privilege. Use it. Don't squander it. When you have an hour and a half to do nothing, liking some stuff on Facebook, maybe take 20 minutes to see who you can call, what representative you can call, what bill might need you to say yes to it. Use that privilege. I'm going to give you a news flash. I've got privilege. Everyone has privilege. What I do with my privilege is I try to help those who I know who have less privilege. Not because it's going to garner me anything, but because I know what it's like not to have privilege. And ironically enough, even when you have privilege, you know what it's like not to have it. At some point, you've been a less than in some social situation. You know what it's like to be there. And you know how bad it feels. And you also know all it took was someone to be willing to invest a little time and energy to bring you up from that place. That's what your role is. Don't think that you're a citizen and don't have that responsibility. You do. Don't think you can just come here, listen to us, and say, I agree, and that's it. No. This is not something you do one day a month. This is something you do every day of the year. This is what you do as a citizen of this country. This is how you change the carceral state. It requires the action of every individual. Because the reason we are here is because of the action or inaction, which is still a choice of every single one of us, myself included. I'm not innocent of it. So I would tell you that is the reality, but the future can be bright. It can be hopeful if you start using that privilege, that ability to act in the way that will get you the result you want to see. It's really that simple, right? There's difficulty along the way. My mother once told me nothing worth having ever comes with ease or speed. She said, it hurt to birth you, but you were worth it. That's just unfortunately or fortunately, that is just the way our universe is set up. So it's no use in bucking against it. Use it and make change. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, Aisha.
He who has a why can endure almost any how. That is a quote from one of my favorite books, Man's Search for Meaning. The first thing people ask when you hear that somebody has committed a crime is, how could you have done that? Instead of saying, I wonder why that person did that. It matters. The circumstances matter. The why matters. Their past, their trauma, that all matters. There are people that are sitting in prison who were victims of some sort of trauma before they got there. And maybe they took that trauma out and it manifested itself into a violent altercation. Do they deserve to spend the rest of their lives in prison because of a mistake that they made? 1 second in time, 1 moment in time? We want to, you think about, I want you to think about 2 things. Think about the person you love the most being harmed in some way and what you will want done to the person who committed the crime against them. Think about it. All right, now I want you to think about if it was your loved one who actually committed that crime. The first thing you want to know is, why did my son do that? Why did my daughter do that? It's not how. You don't want the dirty details. You just want to know what drove them to that. And maybe what did you do wrong? We have all made mistakes. We have all done something that maybe could have sent us to prison, but we didn't get caught for it. Maybe you cheated on an exam. Maybe you drove too fast. Maybe you cut somebody off in traffic. Maybe you drank too much at the bar and then you got in your car. Just think about these things. Think when you hear that somebody's done something wrong, I want you just to take a second before you condemn them, before you punish them, before you write them off and throw away the key. Just think about that individual and what type of life they led prior to that mistake. Let's all just have like an ounce of compassion for each other and an open-mindedness. Let's start shedding light instead of like this darkness perpetuating it. It's so dark, dirty, and overcrowded in that prison. You wouldn't want anyone there. You would not wish that on your worst enemy. There is like an outbreak in the women's prison right now of scabies, or what they are saying is scabies. We don't know what it is. It was there when I was there. It's still there. But we don't even treat animals like that in the shelters. So, like everyone said, like, put your words into action. Come here, listen to us, and then go home and brainstorm. Make a list of things that you think that you can do to end this mass incarceration. What can you do? We can all do something. We can all play a role. Maybe you want to write somebody. Maybe you want to be a mentor to somebody inside. Maybe you know that somebody's coming home and you want to give them a ride somewhere. You want to help them get a job. Because the transition from prison to home is not easy. So again, like, just be compassionate and understanding, and let's help our neighbors.
Well said. Final remarks before we turn it over.
So, like I was saying, like, I think there has to be some balance in between what is justice for people, for victims, and punishment for people who do things, right? Like, it's not black and white. What causes an event to happen is very rarely, this happened because of this. This happened because of this, and all of those things. And where we come in, like what our roles are, is like, it's individual to you. It's individual to where you think you might make an impact, regardless of what it is. For me, like I said, it changed my life in that I never thought about working in corrections, but I cared very much about end-of-life work. But when I got to prison, when I started working in prison, what I realized was it was the trauma work that I really enjoyed. And it was helping somebody and walking with them through how did these things take you from this moment when you were a child to here now, or whenever that event happened to now. And it's just how you can be involved. Like, we're not all going to be activists, because we need other people too. And so it's just trying to figure out who that is, and then also just in thinking about the system, it's like I actually think my personal perspective is that prison is the problem for, like, prison is the bad solution for problems that can be fixed. Right? Like good mental health, addressing mental health in families, keeping families together. That should be in and of itself a public health crisis because of what we know families or families of origin and groups that care for each other can do to create compassion, to create empathetic individuals, so that when faced with hard decisions, you make the right one.
Well said. Please help me in thanking this panel. Okay, let me remind everyone that we are still recording. And we have Ashley Lucas that has a microphone, and I would really love to hear questions, comments, feedback, personal or otherwise.
Hi, excellent panel. Honestly, I think I've been to all the panels. I think this was really the most impactful for me to hear a lot of these personal stories. I'm very curious what the panels thought.
Recorded, you know that.
Okay. Especially a shout out for my colleague Pete and Citizens for Prison Reform, a great nonprofit out of Lansing area. I'm curious, do you feel as a panel that the carceral state is expanding or shrinking? My personal and professional opinion as a lecturer at the University of Michigan Dearborn and also someone that spent 10 years in prison, I think sneakily, and let's attack the Trump administration for a second here, I think they're doing some smoke and mirrors right now. So they passed some federal legislation that's shrinking the federal prison population, and you know, Kim Kardashian is shaking around in the office, and we're getting a few people let out of prison, which is great. I'm happy, but I think it's smoke and mirrors to say, well, we're working on mass incarceration. But I think sneakily, back to the immigration thing, this damn wall and the government shut down. I feel like this whole wall is a way to kind of like maybe trick some people into thinking that there's going to be this massive barrier. So maybe there will be a massive influx of immigrants from the South coming up. Guess what's going to happen to all of them? They're going to be detained, like you mentioned, which in my opinion is going to rapidly expand the carceral state. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Let's take 3 questions at a time and then respond so that we can make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. Thank you for your patience.
Hi, I just wanted to ask if any of you guys are aware of any bills or laws that you think are relevant to this issue that we could contact our congressman about, or if not, then where we could find out about those bills for ourselves.
Okay, and one more question, and then let's tackle those.
Getting the steps in.
Hi. I just noticed that mental health was like a really consistent theme that people touched on. And I'm kind of wondering, like, from personal experience, what, or just like knowledge, what access to mental health looks like after being incarcerated, if there's like more of a stigma when trying to receive services, or if there's like inaccessibility to services just because they're already difficult to receive. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, about that after you're out experience of what that looks like trying to take care of your needs.
Okay, so expanding or contracting carceral state, what bills are available now to weigh in on, and post-release mental health care?
Yeah, so I want to touch on the first and second question because I feel like there's a connection there. So you're asking about like smoke and mirrors, what's going on in my opinion. So yes, definitely the detention of immigrants has definitely gone up with this new administration. The priority is to detain anyone who is removable, who's deportable, regardless of whether they have a criminal history or not. So it's definitely expanding. And part of the smoking mirrors, I think, goes to the second question. A lot of the changes that are happening in the immigration system aren't really going through legislation. I mean, just look at the shutdown. That sort of exemplifies that the legislation isn't doing much, but Trump is sort of going through the change in a backdoor kind of way. So just to educate everyone out there, there's been a lot of changes in how USCIS, which is United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, these are all executive agencies. So whenever there's any sort of change, it doesn't really go through Congress. It goes through a notice and comment period. So you can't call your representative and say, hey, I support this bill, because there aren't really many out there in terms of immigration, but there are many notice and comment periods happening that are changing the rules of immigration. One just passed, and I wish we would have had this sooner, about the Flores settlement, which talks about incarcerating children. Incarcerating children has a huge effect on them if it's beyond, I think, 72 hours. And so the Flores settlement said that no child can be incarcerated beyond 12 days, and basically the administration wants to get rid of that. And the backdoor way that they're doing this is through regulation. So it's not calling your senator, it's not calling your representative, it's basically just making a comment. So if you want to be a troll to the Trump administration, you can make these comments, and you can make as many as you want, and they have to consider all of these comments. So it's regulations.gov. Take a look at that. You can also sign up for our PIF campaign, Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, on our website, where you can get information on when you can make these notice and comments yourself. So like us any way that you can so that we can get this information out to you.
You want us to tackle all three here?
Whatever, you don't have to, just what grabs you, and then we'll take three more.
Okay. As far as the smoke and mirrors, I use the old bait and switch, or what's this hand doing over there? As far as the state's concerned, the prison population in Michigan is going down. Two things are happening alongside of that are wrong and need to be changed. Number one, MDOC does have some programs that are working. There are vocational villages you might have heard of, vocational training. There are some other amazing things happening on a facility-to-facility basis. The problem is prison population goes down, legislature dollar signs. Close that prison, but guess what? You can't roll that money back into your project that's working so well. We're going to take that from you. So that I see as a huge issue. So anytime you hear anything that has to do with that, I encourage you, please let your voice be heard. Hey, wait a minute. I think every single facility should be a vocational village, personally. Every single one. And not just, I think there's 3 now, one coming at Huron Valley. The other thing is the people that they are increasing the parole rate. That is happening in Michigan. Some things are a problem with that, and I'm not going to speak from personal experience, I'm going to speak generally, is the idea of folks having to pay for their tethers when they can't even get a job, let alone pay for the other testing that's required as a part of their parole. Coming out without a job, possibly not being able to find a place to live because of your criminal record. It's not how it was 20, 30 years ago where you'd come out and lie on a resume. Those days are gone. One quick Google and, don't Google my name, please. But so I think that's a huge problem. If you're going to cut some people a break and recognize that they're coming out and they're going to recognize and they're going to do some good things, let's not pile on some bills on top of that. Regarding mental health, coming out, a big problem with that I've seen personally with some people I've dealt with is people inside with severe mental health problems tend to get in more trouble. Whether they're victims and it turns into a brawl, as I said, it's rarely found out who's done what. They get into more trouble, they get more tickets, they end up doing more time. There's a thing called maxing out. You max out your time, it's have a nice day, you're out the door with no support services that are given somebody that is out before their tail is up. In other words, whenever I hear somebody say they've done their 10-year minimum and they're out and people and people are outraged because they could have been kept longer, they don't realize that if somebody maxes out, they are maxing out on, from society's point of view, with no controls, no drug testing, no, hey, you have to have a job, or no curfews, no step down approach, which some inmates, prisoners, former prisoners do require. On the flip side of that, you walk out with no help. The MDOC cannot do anything for you by law anymore. The end. You're out the door. You maxed out. Society got its pound of flesh. Have a nice day. So,
really briefly, how y'all start. Smoke and mirrors. We're Americans, so we have a healthy paranoia of our government, with right reason. History shows that we have right reason, but history also shows that happens when we're least involved. Do I believe in smoke and mirrors? To a large extent, yes, because we're allowing it to be. But I also think that our paranoia in that sense may aid us because we don't necessarily trust. You know, if someone's been hitting me in my face for 5 years and then one day says, hey, I got a present for you, and raises their hand, I'm not going to be like, wow, good dude. I'm probably going to duck, right? So duck. That's my point. Duck. But be prepared to do what you have to do to affect change. As far as bills go, there are so many. My first thing, Google. Like Google. Like if I wanted to know where Hatcher Library was, I could Google it. Bam. But one bill that's particularly important to me is the Raise the Age initiative.
Yes.
It's been going on, and it's so simple. It's simply raising the age of the adult from 17 to 18 as far as it goes with charging them with adult crimes. I can't buy a pack. In Ann Arbor, you can't buy a pack of cigarettes at what, 20? Like 21, right? But you can do 20 to 40 years in prison. You better know that. So I think that's the one that immediately comes because I was 17 when I committed my crime, and I think of how differently things would have been had I been entered a different system that thought more of the fact that I had not developed my brain capacity to think like a responsible adult. Mental health. Mental health upsets me, right? Because when you leave, I'll use myself as an example. I left, I was able to find some insurance, and if I am diligent enough, maybe I can get a therapist. But I have to already be at a space where I am able to put forth that effort, right? That is the difference. If you do not have the resources or ability or drive, if your depression is so deep that you don't have the drive, you don't get the help. No one's seeking you out to assist you. The program, the situations that you find yourself in, or should I say the department, is not making sure you have that, nor is your parole agency, nor is anyone else except for like our linkage project partners at PCAP. Like, there are small pockets of people, but again, we are small pockets that are trying to become a larger consortium, but that's difficult. So yeah, people are not getting the assistance they need. It does not become any easier. It just becomes a different set of difficulties and hurdles that you have to overcome.
So there's a $100 million new jail that they're trying to build in the city of Detroit. And that is something that the Detroit Justice Center is really trying to organize against them building that new jail. I mean, why not build a new school?
Right.
And in order to build that jail, they have to fill those beds. So that means criminalizing more people. Aside from that, with the mental health aspect, you have to be pretty low functioning to really get help. From my experience, when I came home, the first thing I wanted to do was find a therapist. But everywhere I went, community mental health, Catholic social services, they all said, you look fine to me. I said, do you not know where I've been for the last 9 years? PTSD is really running rampant through these blood veins. Like, I need help. And they wouldn't help me. And also with the people that I serve as a bail disruptor, I often have to find resources for those people. And a lot of those people that are sitting in those jails have mental health issues, and finding resources to help them, or finding shelter for the homeless, finding shelters for women who have experienced domestic violence at home is so difficult. So when we talk about the carceral system and is it expanding, I 100% think it is expanding when they're trying to build new jails and shut down 15 schools in the city of Detroit. Mm-hmm. When they don't want to give us insurance. So if people don't have insurance, they can't get the mental health that they need. and they're out there committing crimes. They don't want to give you a job, so you're going to go out and you're going to rob, steal, and do whatever it takes to take care of your family. So you're going to jail, and then you're going to prison. So I think it absolutely is expanding, but if you just Google, you,
Shout out
You-
to search engines.
yeah, you can, or Bing, whichever one you use, you can find an organization to partner with and do something about. If you live in the city of Detroit, you can do something. Write the mayor. Little Caesars Arena standing tall, and now they're about to build a jail that's going to stand even taller. Like, we can do something about these things. And if you don't know what to do, go talk to Ashley Lucas.
Right there. There she is. PCAP members, past, present. Look, we here. Holla at us.
So for mental health, it's a systems issue. If you come out of prison and you're lucky, you will have already been connected to Medicaid, but if not, that could still take some time to get up and running. Community mental health is the only place that you can get mental health services in most counties in Michigan, and you have to have Medicaid. So if you don't have that, how are you going to get any services? Because then you have to private pay. How are you going to private pay when you don't have a job? And so, I mean, this goes into like all sorts of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like what they were talking about, like having the ability to provide for yourself, provide for your families, meet those needs so that you can then have that extra energy to focus on yourself and your mental health. It's nearly impossible.
Could I follow up just 15 seconds here? Regarding the bills, there's something you can do right now with the Michigan legislature. Go to the Michigan legislature website, go to the committees, and little clicks, put your email address in, and they will notify you, they will email you on what's coming down the line, what the committee's taking up, when the hearings are. And once bills are prepared and are out there, bill numbers, new legislature, so there's going to be a lot of rehash, you can check on that bill, put your name down, and they will notify you by email when that committee is going to be hearing on that bill, and they will let anyone, I'm living proof, anyone go in there and sit down and give testimony at these hearings. So not only can you talk to your local legislator about backing these bills, you can go and give personal input. Just don't use my name.
So as we end, I'd love to invite any more closing remarks from the audience, comments or questions, but comments are fine too. Let's have you take us out the door.
Well, I'm not from Michigan. I'm from Chicago, and as a second career, I decided to teach in CPS, and I taught in the inner city. I am privileged. These poor kids. I taught sophomores, freshmen. These are kids. I had an extremely intelligent young man tell me guns are my life. Had no regard for life, his or anybody else's. You talk about the state, it's going to keep growing because we're feeding it. We are not handling these children. And it starts in grade school. Yep. By the time they hit me, it was all done with. The smart kids in the class, I taught geometry. Smart kids in the class started getting A's. All of a sudden, I started noticing their grades declining. Peer pressure. The fellow students were like, "What are you doing? You're making us look bad." They come into my classroom, and probably for good reason, they're practicing on Coke bottles, putting condoms on there. These young women, I saw many that could have done fabulous things with their lives. We had no books. We had no after-school programs. The schools were locked. I mean, they weren't regular doors. I mean, those were prison doors on those schools. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but it's a blind eye. You know, we got Lane Tech. I don't know if you heard of that school. I mean, the sidewalks are gilded. Well, I guess where all the rich, people in the city get to send their schools, and Latin school and all these others. While on the south side, these poor kids, besides living in food deserts, they're fending for themselves. They're children.
Thank you for that.
And so I'm not sure what the answer is, but I feel.
Well, I think you said it very beautifully, which is that we know what works, and we know that resources work, right? And we know that kids with resources thrive. So we actually do know what works. The challenge is to treat all children as our own. Any other comments? One last comment. Thank you.
So I just want to thank the panel. I really enjoyed the comments of every single one of you, and I really appreciate it. I appreciate the first speaker for giving what we're struggling against a name. It is racism, and we have to face that. I appreciate the fact that many of you brought up that once a person leaves prison, that new trauma begins. And Asia, I think you brought up the school to prison pipeline, much along the line of the comments of the last speaker. These are systemic and institutionally racist systems that I think need to be addressed.
Well said. Thank you. Please join us next month when we have the next session, which is called Control in the Carceral State. And we have a sign-up sheet. So if this is your first time here, or you're not on our mailing list or our sign-up sheet, please put your name before you leave. And again, thank you so much for being here this evening.